Just not used to things being back to semi-normal. A little bit of miscommunication on my part there, but thank you for leading those songs. I appreciate Austin's efforts. He always asks me, and what kind of things you preaching on to get ideas, and he's always got good choices. I appreciate his work. It's good to be here with you this morning. This is exciting to see so many. We're kind of spread out, which makes it feel like so many. Maybe makes it feel like more than there is, but certainly feels like a lot of people here this morning. I appreciate you being here. We're going to be studying the book of Numbers this morning. I've already given you a hint of that. We're going to be in Numbers. I went through Leviticus last time because I felt like Leviticus was really important for us in our walk with God. To understand the system God set up in the Old Testament is very understandable and relatable to the New Testament, to understanding our cleansing and the sacrifice that Jesus has given to us. But I feel like all of these in the Pentateuch are so important for us as Christians, and I really wanted to do Numbers as well. I'm going to try not to be as long on Numbers as I was on Leviticus, but I'm going to try to get all this information in anyway as we study through this book. If you've had kids, or if you've been around kids for any length of time, you're probably aware of the whiny tone that kids often have. You know it. It's something that they go through in a stage of life when they don't get what they want and they don't know how to handle it. They're not content with what they have, and so the response is, I'm going to manipulate through whiny tones, through complaining, through grumbling, and things like that. Or sometimes maybe we've had our children cry at us over some irrational fear. I remember one time dropping Jenna off at a grocery store, and I'm not going in with a 2-year-old, and so we're going to stay in the car. I drop Jenna off, and I start to go, and the child just starts screaming and crying, irrational fear of me abandoning the mother in the grocery store, and we're driving away, just terrified and unconsolable in that fear. Kids go through a lot, and they're trying to learn and develop and understand things, and so we see that in them, that they struggle with life itself and going through things that we see as not really that big of a deal, something that everybody has to adjust to and get used to. But do adults do those kinds of things? Do we as adults sometimes whine, sometimes complain, sometimes grumble, sometimes have irrational fears of things that we probably shouldn't have, and let that overtake us in different ways? Well, God gave us a book to help us to see that if we don't see it very well. And that book is the book of Numbers. As we study through the book of Numbers, we see very much that as full-grown adults, we're not much different than our children in this way. The book of Numbers is beginning at Mount Sinai. The people of Israel have been at Mount Sinai for about 2 years. They've entered Mount Sinai in that area during the Exodus as God saved them from Egypt. They came to Mount Sinai. God gave them the law. He gave them instructions for the tabernacle, and they built the tabernacle. And then in Leviticus, we saw they worshiped God there at the tabernacle, and God gave them all the instructions for worship and understanding how a sinful people can draw near to a holy God. God makes a way for that to be possible. In Numbers, we pick up there at Mount Sinai, and we see that 2 years they've been at Mount Sinai. They've been there for 2 years worshiping God and learning about God and drawing near to God and going through this whole process. Well, the book of Numbers starts out great because they're there at Mount Sinai. They've gone through a little bit of rebellion with the calf worship, and they've been corrected by that. Now they're able to draw near to God to worship. Things go great in the book of Numbers to begin with. But as we get to the latter part, everything falls apart, and that's what we start to know the book of Numbers for, is the falling apart of the people of Israel. It's called the book of Numbers because there's a census that's being taken multiple times in the book. The majority of the book's not about census taking. That would be really boring. But it's majority about a storyline, a lot of different stories that we're not going to have enough time to cover all of them in detail today. But it has these censuses in here where God commands a census to get an idea of the number of people of Israel, and then he excludes the Levites. And then he looks at the Levites in chapter 3, and he looks at all the Levites from 1 month old upward, and then he looks at all the Levites from 30 to 50 and does 2 different censuses with the Levites. So there's some number taking in there that kind of gets boring as we look at that. But it's giving you a picture of God's people and as they're there among him on the mountain. But whenever you get to chapter 2 of Numbers, you see the arrangement of the camp in Israel. All of Israel is told where to live in the camp around Mount Sinai and where they will live as they travel, as they journey from Sinai into the Promised Land. And this is kind of an illustration of what it looks like. You have all 12 tribes represented, and you pretty much have 3 tribes north, 3 tribes south, 3 tribes east, 3 tribes west. And then you have the Levites in the middle with Moses and Aaron and his family. With the tabernacle at the very center. The tabernacle is the dwelling place of God. It's where God meets with his people, where they go to sacrifice to him. And this picture shows smoke coming up from the tabernacle, which represents the glory of God being hidden in smoke. Glory of God is usually his shining presence. And it's hidden in a cloud of smoke so the people aren't terrified and so that they're able to survive. This is kind of a representation of what I see whenever I read through that. There are other illustrations that are similar but slightly different. But anyway, this is the way I see it. Notice what's at the center. Notice the relevance of that. That as the people of Israel are living in the wilderness, God is to be the center of the nation. He is everything to Israel. He is the one who is providing them with everything they need. He is the one who brought them out of Israel. He is the one who wants to dwell in the midst of his people. And he shows himself doing that as he puts himself at the very center of the whole nation as they live in the wilderness. After you see that in chapter 2, and then the census, as I said, in chapters 3 and 4, you get to chapter 5 and you see description, commands of God wanting his people to be holy. It sounds a lot like Leviticus, desiring his people to be holy. If God's going to dwell among his people, it is extremely important that they be holy. And there is a test in there for adultery, and then there's a vow that can be taken to become a Nazirite and become, set yourself apart as even more holy than everyone else. And so there's a description there that God wants this holy people, very much like we saw in Leviticus. Then you go into chapter 7 and you get information about offering different sacrifices. Every tribe offers a grain sacrifice, a burnt sacrifice, a sin sacrifice, and a peace sacrifice on each day. There's 12 days of offering these different kinds of sacrifices to God. And there's this great outpouring of worship and drawing near to God, and you see everything is really working the way it should, and everything seems to be going well. This is the good part of Numbers, as we see. When we get to chapter 8 and through chapter 10, there's more description of that. People are doing what they're supposed to do. Everything's good. Look at chapter 9, verse 18. This is really kind of summarizing the whole first section. It says, at the command of the Lord, the people of Israel set out. They're setting out from Sinai. And at the command of the Lord, they camped. As long as the cloud rested over the tabernacle, they remained in camp. Even when the camp continued over the tabernacle many days, the people of Israel kept the charge of the Lord and did not set out. Sometimes the cloud was a few days over the tabernacle, and according to the command of the Lord, they remained in camp. Then according to the command of the Lord, they set out. And sometimes the cloud remained from evening until morning. And when the cloud lifted in the morning, they set out. Or if it continued for a day and a night, when the cloud lifted, they set out. Whether it was 2 days or a month or a longer time that the cloud continued over the tabernacle abiding there, the people of Israel remained in the camp and did not set out, but when it lifted, they set out. At the command of the Lord, they camped, and at the command of the Lord, they set out. They kept the charge of the Lord at the command of the Lord by Moses. Wow. Did you get that picture? This is near the end of this whole section, and it's just giving you the emphasis of this section that the people were doing what God wanted them to do. They were following the Lord. They were going when he said go. They were staying when he said stay. They did not run off to the promised land, leaving God behind in the wilderness. No. And they did not stay put thinking, oh, this is kind of nice. We'll let God go ahead. We're happy here. They did what God said. And the end of this whole section, verse 35 of chapter 10, this is what Moses would say every time the ark would set out. As they would leave, the ark would be at the front. And Moses said, "Arise, O Lord, and let your enemies be scattered, and let those who hate you flee before you." And then whenever the ark would rest, he would say, "Return, O Lord, to the 10,000 thousands of Israel." You just get this neat picture of an obedient Israel and of a God who is loving them and of a leader who is saying, "Go, Lord, and conquer our enemies for us and take care of us." And whenever he rests, "Come on back, God. Let's enjoy one another and have that relationship still." Notice the first words of chapter 11. "And the people complained in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes. And when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some outlying parts of the camp." These 10 chapters of bliss come to a screeching halt in chapter 11. And in chapter 11, we transition into 10 rebellions of the people. 10 rebellions of the people. From chapter 11 all the way to chapter 25, we have 10 occurrences where the people rebel against the Lord. And the first one is found there in chapter 11. They say there's no meat. Oh, we're ready to go back to Egypt. There's no meat here. And then they start remembering, oh man, there was cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic back in Egypt. We don't have any of that good stuff anymore. And they're complaining to the Lord. Upset because they don't have any meat or any of these great things that they enjoy. And so God hears their cries, and God says, I want you to let them know I'm going to bring some meat. I'm going to bring some quail to them. I'm going to give them so much quail, look at verse 19, that they're not just going to eat one day or 2 days or 5 days or 10 days or 20 days, but a whole month until it comes out at your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you, because you have rejected the Lord who is among you and have wept before him, saying, "Why did we come out of Egypt?" You see the people's rebellion against the Lord. And God's solution is, okay, you're so craving for meat, I'm going to give it to you in abundance. And those who are the most rebellious, God destroys because of their defiance of God, their upset, their idolatry of meat, essentially. God destroys some of those who had the craving, it says in verse 34. Then chapter 12, we see another rebellion, but this is an odd one. Miriam and Aaron, Moses' brother and sister, rebel against Moses. They see Moses has married a Cushite, and they go out against Moses. They're saying, God's spoken through us too. We're as good as Moses. And they try to usurp Moses' authority because he married a Cushite. Well, God steps in and makes it very clear he has no problem with this. There is no issue here. That Moses is the one who he has been speaking to. In verse 7, he is faithful in all my house. With him I speak mouth to mouth, clearly and not in riddles. And he beholds the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? And the anger of the Lord was kindled against them, and he departed. God is angry with them because of their anger with Moses, because he married a Cushite, as though that's a big deal, as though that's something that can't be overcome. Now, they were commanded not to mix with the people of the land, but Cush was somewhere else, and marrying a Cushite can be okay if you're not being led astray by their idol worship. That's the main fear. If they're being brought in and being made a part of Israel, it's okay. Mixing with the foreign nations wasn't bad in that event. And here he says, Moses has a good heart. Moses is fine in doing this. I have nothing against Moses. And you're just seeking to usurp his authority in order to promote yourself. And God's not happy about it. So God brings down leprosy on Miriam. And Moses has to intercede for her in order to cure her of her leprosy, but she still has to be rejected for 7 days because she has leprosy. Another rebellion, and this is probably the most notable in the book, is in chapters 13 and 14. The people travel up and they get to the southern border of the promised land. And they're about to enter in, and they send spies into the land to see what the land is like and to see what the people there are like. And as they go into the land, these 12 spies, 10 of them come back with a bad report. They say the people are huge. They've got these fortified cities. There's no way we'll ever conquer them. We need to just make a leader and go back to Egypt. And Joshua and Caleb are the only two that say, no, it's an exceedingly good land, and God will surely give it to us. They've done all of this coming out of Egypt. They've seen the plagues. They've seen everything that's happened, that God has been able to provide for them all along the way. They've heard all these promises of God to provide them the land. This is the promise that was made to Abraham back in Genesis that is now going to be fulfilled. And they refuse to do it. The people shrink back. The people are terrified of the danger that lies ahead of them. They're afraid that God won't be with them, that God won't help them. And they say, let's stone Moses and Aaron, and let's stone Joshua and Caleb, and let's appoint leaders, and let's go back to Egypt. This is what their fear does. It turns into this rebellion, wanting to murder their very leaders. And Moses has to intercede for the people. They're about to stone him. The glory of the Lord descends to kind of stop everything. And God says, get out of the way, Moses. I'm about to wipe them out and create a new nation with you. And Moses intercedes for the people. And he says, Lord, you can't wipe them out. Because what will the nations think? They'll think you can't bring your people into the land. You can't wipe them out. Plus, remember what you showed me on Mount Sinai, verse 18 of chapter 14. You showed me your character, that you're slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, forgiving iniquity and transgression, but by no means clearing the guilty, visiting the iniquity on the fathers and the children and the third and fourth generation. You can punish them without completely removing them, Lord. Give them consequences for their sin, but don't completely remove them. And God listens to the plea of Moses. He decides that of the people of Israel who were going to go in, only those under 20 will go in. And everybody else will have to die in the wilderness as they wander in the wilderness for 40 years. Moses tells this news to everybody, and they rebel again. They don't want to wander in the wilderness. They say, okay, well, fine, we'll go into the promised land. We'll conquer all these people. And God says, no, I'm not with you. They don't even listen to his command then. They go out and they're defeated by their enemies. They rebel after rebelling in response to rebellion. And it's interesting. It seems like they have faith now, but they don't have faith in God's word. They have faith in themselves, and they're just upset about losing what they had. Then in chapter 15, he gives some explanation about sin. There are unintentional sins where people are led astray from what they ought to be doing. And then there are high-handed sins. Verse 30, the person who does anything with a high hand, and those sins mean that person needs to be cut off from the people. And then in verse 32, we see another rebellion. The Sabbath is not paid attention to. Somebody's out there picking up sticks on the Sabbath. And so God says, stone him with stones. You broke the covenant. You broke the command with this defiance. He needs to be put to death. And so this great example is set for everybody about rebellion, that those who rebel are going to be put to death. Then we get another rebellion in chapter 16. This is a very notable rebellion as well. This is called Korah's rebellion. Korah is a man who is the leader. He's a Levite. And he decides, he's one of the Levites who gets to go in, and he's not a priest, but he gets to fold up and carry all the holy items from the tabernacle. He decides, there's no difference between me and the priest. Surely I can do the work of the priest. What makes them so good? And he brings the Reubenites in and says, you guys are going to be like Levites, and we're going to assist the priests, and we're going to be like priests now. And Moses is irate. Moses is extremely angry about all of this because God set them up to be Levites. They get to go where none of the rest of Israel goes, and that's not enough for them. They want more. And so Moses says, God, do something different so that they know you're not pleased with this. Open up the ground and consume them. And he does. He consumes them. He destroys those who are part of Korah's rebellion. And as a result of that, the congregation gets upset the next day, and they rebel and get upset saying, you killed them. And God has to judge them as well and says, get away from the midst of this congregation, verse 45, that I may consume them in a moment. And Moses has to intercede again to protect the people from God. And then Aaron runs through the camp as this plague breaks out and provides a censer and runs it through the camp and stops there from being so much death through that plague. But he does kill a lot of people who are part of that rebellion again. Then we see in chapter 20, chapter 17 is Aaron's staff budding to let everybody know that he is the one who's been chosen. Chapter 18 and 19 are laws about priests and Levites, because obviously they need to be reminded of that. And then chapter 20, we get to another rebellion. And this is a rebellion at the waters of Meribah, where the people are complaining about not having water. And they grumble and they quarrel with Moses. And Moses responds with going to God, and God tells him, I want you to talk to the rock and make water come out. But Moses says this in verse 10, hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock? And Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his staff twice. And the water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank and their livestock. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe in me to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them. Wow. This is a big event. I mean, the rebellion has been progressing, it seems like. And as you get to this event and you see Moses himself is the one who is at fault. After the people sin, he sins. He makes the mistake. He does not regard God as holy. He strikes the rock twice instead of speaking to the rock as God commanded. And now he is at fault and he is unable to go into the promised land. It's a very devastating verse. If you've been studying through Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and you've seen Moses throughout all this, you're like, wow, Moses is an amazing man. But even he himself was not able to enter into the promised land. Also in chapter 20, we see Miriam dies and Aaron dies in the wilderness. And then chapter 21, we see another rebellion, number 9. And in this rebellion, the people are impatient as they're wandering in the wilderness, and they say again, why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There's no food or water. And so God sends, it sounds like a broken record, right? And this is the struggle of this book. It's like, again they say this stuff? God sends serpents among them now. Imagine a bunch of snakes in the camp. And these serpents are called fiery serpents. They bite, and it probably burns intensely as a result of the bite. And notice what the people do in verse 7. They come to Moses and say, we have sinned, for we have spoken against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord that he may take away the serpents from us. So Moses prayed for the people. And the Lord said, make a fiery serpent and set it on a pole, and everyone who is bitten, when he sees it, shall live. So Moses made a bronze serpent, set it on a pole, and if a serpent bit anyone, he would look at the bronze serpent and live. This whole event is really odd and interesting. Number one, because we remember the serpent from Genesis being the cause of all of this fall and all of this evil. And now God sends serpents so that they're being bit by them, so they have a physical representation of what's going on. You're poisoned by your sin, by your evil. And then they have to do something in faith. They have to confess their sins, and they have to go and look at this serpent after Moses prays for them and makes intercession for them again, and God heals them of their poison and that fire within them. That whole event just stands out as a really interesting event. It's talked about in the New Testament, and we'll see it actually at the end. Then the final rebellion is a big one from chapter 22 all the way through chapter 25. So this is a big rebellion, chapter 26 really, that takes place. In chapter 22 through 25, Balaam is a prophet who is called by the king of Moab to come and curse the people. And instead of cursing him, all he can do is bless the people, because God just wants to bless his people. And even though the enemies want his people to be cursed, he's going to bless his people. He's determined to bless his people. But then Balaam tells Balak, after the 3 blessings and receiving money, he tells him, if you really want the people to be harmed, you just have to send them women. And then they'll enter into the idolatry of the women, and then they'll offend God, and then they will be punished for their sin. And that's what happens in chapter 25. Chapter 25. They intermix with the Moabites, and they become defiled in sexual immorality and in idolatry. And as a result, they're punished for that. Phinehas rises up and slays one of the chiefs who are responsible and kind of puts everything at peace again. Okay. It's a lot of rebellion, right? That's a lot of rebellion. And that's the point of this book, to try to get across a lot of rebellion. Chapter 26 has another census that kind of marks a new generation. And then after that, there's just a huge listing of commands for this newer generation to prepare them to enter into the promised land. We don't have time to go through all of those different commands. Here's kind of a physical representation of maybe what their travels look like. I don't think I can get this thing to work very well. Never can. It's over there. Maybe I should go the other way. I don't know. Anyway, you see them going down to Sinai, and then they go up, and then they go east of the Jordan, and that's where they're located at the end of this book. That's where they end up. One verse we'll look at the very end that's interesting is chapter 35, verse 34. He gives commands for this coming generation not to murder. And then he says, if someone does murder, this is the way you handle it. If someone accidentally murders, this is the way you handle it. But you don't just let the murderer go. Verse 34, he says, you shall not defile the land in which you live. Murder without justice is defiling the land. And he says, in the midst of which I dwell. For I, the Lord, dwell in the midst of the people of Israel. This is a main focus of God throughout all of this, is that I'm dwelling with you. I'm living with you. I want to be with you. And he is, even though they are this stubborn, rebellious people. He's living with them. He's staying with them. And we should just be blown away by that as we see all this rebellion. So applying Deuteronomy, go to 1 Corinthians 10. Just go ahead and get there, because we're going to read from there in just a second. Notice in Numbers they started out great. Everything was going good for them because they were following the commands of the Lord. Everything was going well. They were observing and wherever God told them to go, they were going. Everything seemed good. But then they fall, and they just keep falling. They keep rebelling. They have all these passions. They have all these desires that rise up in them, and they don't know how to remain faithful to God. The temptations seem to be too much for them. How does any of this relate to us, though? Look at 1 Corinthians 10, verse 1. He says, I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea, the Exodus. And all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and the sea. And all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank from the rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Notice how he just compared us to Israel and said, they've gone through what we've gone through. We have the same experience ourselves. As we were baptized, as we have been fed and nurtured and given spiritual food and drink to understand God. But he says in verse 5, nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now these things took place as an example for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play, referring to the golden calf. We must not indulge in sexual immorality, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. We must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents. nor grumble, as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. Therefore let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed, lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. Let's pause there. You see that in this, Paul makes a reference to Exodus and Numbers to try to help us understand we're going through this same thing. We're in the wilderness. We have been saved through the Exodus, through our Exodus. We're now in the wilderness. We're being tempted. We're being tested. We're being tried to see where our heart is, to see if we will shrink back from following God and fail to enter into the promised land. The question is, are we grumbling over our suffering? Are we complaining? Are we failing to put our trust in God? Are we rebelling against those who lead us and trying to usurp authority in different ways, like they did? Are we discouraged by their unfaithfulness? If we're leaders like Moses, are we just discouraged because the people rebel and they rebel and they rebel and they make mistakes and they're unfaithful? Are we shrinking back? And are we failing to put our faith in God's goodness? We have greater blessings than they do. We're similar, but we have greater blessings than they do. What are we doing with it? Are we truly being faithful? Do we understand that God is faithful to us, that he's helping us along this journey, that as we have temptations, he's making sure those temptations are not too much for us, that we can overcome those temptations? Are we trusting him to do that? And are we avoiding those temptations? Are we falling to the temptation, or are we overcoming those temptations by the power of God working through us? Well, if we are failing, which I found myself doing at times in my life, I hope that the book of Numbers gives you encouragement to know that God was still with them. He was patient. He gave them consequences for their sins, and they suffered more. But their response to greater suffering was greater rebellion, and we don't want to do that. If our response is confession and repentance and faith, then we can find in God the love, the mercy, the compassion that we need to enter into that promised land when this life is over. And that's what we're living for. If we trust in this world, we're not going to get what we're looking for. It's all going to fail us. It's all going to fall apart. Everything on this earth will be destroyed. And if we live to see that, then that's it. But even if we don't, it's all going to be taken away from us in a moment. But what God offers us is eternal, if we'll put our trust in him. If there's anybody here this morning that needs to confess your faith, put your trust in God, and repent of those sins that you've committed, we want to encourage you to do that. We want to help you in any way that we can. Please come as we stand and sing.